my pleasure and delight to be able to, an honor to be able to introduce Patricia Kelso to all of you today. Most of you know of her already, but I want to give you a little more background because she has a wonderful, wonderful background, and I think it's useful to know. So, first of all, you should know that I think May 21st she turned 90 and just returned from a trip to Europe. She just returned from a trip to Europe a week or two ago, where she celebrated her birthday there. I would say, obviously, as you'll hear, she's had more experience and more knowledge and more input in ESOPs, more history, more knowledge of this than any person living. She grew up in Indiana, and I think she left home before she even graduated from high school. Went to San Antonio, where she was involved in journalism, and she became you might say, an early day community organizer in the Latino community in San Antonio, where she was friends and colleagues with several of the Latino leaders who became national leaders for the movement later on. Well-known names and leaders in that community. And then her colleagues persuaded her that given her abilities, her obvious abilities, she ought to go to college. So she went to the University of Texas, as I did later on, and graduated there, and got married along the way, or after graduating, to a young man from Harvard. They lived in Boston a year or two, and then he was transferred to Sweden, which was a nice experience for her to live in Sweden for 6 or 7 years.
7 years.
7 years. Then they were divorced. She came back and applied for a job as a research assistant to an ad she read in, I guess, the San Francisco Chronicle. It turned out to be Mr. Kelso, his firm, looking for an assistant, a research assistant, because Kelso had written and was interested in promoting ESOPs. So she came in let's back up. Mr. Kelso invented and established the first ESOP in 1956. And Patricia then came on board in 62 or so.
63.
63. I came along in 67. And along the way, Kelso wrote the first 2 books, I think, and after that, Patricia took off, and then they read much better after Patricia took off. And so it started from there, and you have to realize the incredible synergy Lewis and Patricia had, and also the incredible stamina and stick-to-itiveness they had, because 1956 was the first ESOP. It was then 56, 60, well, it was 1984. It was another 10 years from when you came in 62 or 4, 60.
63.
63, so 73, 74, it was another 10 years before ESOPs were legislated into ERISA, and another 20 years until 1984 when the tax incentives came along that really got it going. So there was 30 years that they were preaching to the world and to the country, mainly the country. They met with top owners of Fortune 500 companies on down to senators, governors, legislators. They left no stone unturned, and still it took 30 years to get this really launched. Then after that, it still took a long time. It still evolved very slowly. It only seems that only now it's maybe really taking off. We'll yet to see. So the Kelso firm moved to New York and later on and became one of the biggest firms on Wall Street. I pursued the ESOP alternative, and then lots of other firms now have gotten into it. But you look back now, and according to the NCEO, there's 14 million employee owners That's almost twice as many union members in the private industry. It's over $1 trillion of company stock that's owned, by employees. Not all of that's ESOPs, but a good portion of it is. And you look back and you say, my gosh, none of this would have happened but for Louis and Patricia Kelso. And not only that, back starting in the 90s, she started getting interested in Russia. She saw that the Soviet system was going to fall apart, got involved and made many trips to Russia, meeting with high-level Russian executives to try to plant the idea of the ESOP as being a transition tool towards private ownership in Russia. That didn't quite work out. As we know, the oligarchs contributed money to Yeltsin, and Yeltsin repaid their favor by giving them everything. Then she moved on to China and sponsored 2 conferences that I participated in, and probably 2 or 3 more beyond that, with top-level people, officials in the Chinese government to promote ESOPs there, which they do have ESOPs. They just don't have the tax incentives, and they're structured a little bit differently. We try to convince them to use the more American, the US model, more than their model, which is sort of an adapted savings and thrift plan without leverage in their model. And we made some progress there. You did. Then
You did too.
Then in the last 10 years, since 2000 or so, she's co-sponsored, must be 6 or 7 or 8 conferences with the European Commission, promoting ESOP ownership and research about the prevalence of financial participation in Europe, and she's used that strategy of sort of coming in the back door, not trying to sell them an American ESOP, but talking about just expanding financial participation in general. So, as I said earlier, I don't think there's any person alive who has given more thought to this and has done more to implement it than Patricia Kelso. I give you Patricia Kelso.
Well, after that introduction, I have to ask, who is this person? The bad news is that I had written a long talk that was very educational, and you would know a lot that you probably don't know after I finished it, and I left it at home. And so the good news, I guess, is that I am going to speak extemporaneously, which will be more fun for you, I'm sure. I have permission from Marianne Beister to be as outrageous as I want to be. And Marianne said, I'm sure you won't have any trouble with that. But I'm channeling Louis Kelso today, and Louis's thinking was outrageous enough. So I will begin with describing his work, which I certainly participated in largely, but the driving intelligence was his. Louis invented the ESOP in 1956. Can you all hear me, by the way? And the ESOP was the prototype of the leveraged buyout. It was unique in that it was based on using future earnings of the stock of the corporation to finance stock ownership for employees and for corporate expansion, for corporate purposes, acquisitions, etc., all could be done by making shareholders of the employees. Conventional finance is based on past savings. The rule of finance is if you own something now and invest it, you'll own everything and more. It's really, the rule is, to him that hath shall be given even more. That's the rule of conventional finance. Lewis didn't approve of that. Lewis became interested in economics during the Great Depression. He was 16 years old in 1929 when the stock market crashed. He was a Depression thinker, like Keynes. And the economy went into a 10-year coma. It was ended only by World War II. And Lewis couldn't understand why this had happened. And he asked his elders, and they said, well, it's the way a capitalist system is. It always crashes from time to time, and we don't know why. We have some theories, but Lewis didn't think this was an answer. So he began to study it, and he was a 16-year-old boy, I think, at this time. And he began to read, and he went to parochial school, and where he had a classical education. And he graduated first in his class and got a scholarship to the University of Colorado. And he decided that his big interest was economics, and so he would major in economics. So he headed for the economics department on registration day and explained why he wanted to study economics to the chairman of the department. To his amazement, he was rejected. The chairman of the economics department said, "Young man, you're just the kind of young man we don't want here. You're nothing but a troublemaker." And Lewis was terribly chagrined, but the chairman of the department was quite right. He had spotted a real troublemaker, because paradigm changers are always troublemakers. And it's amusing to go into the capitals of Europe and the small towns of Europe and see the statues erected and the memorial plates to people who were burned at the stake. And now they're the pride of their country. I always was very happy that Lewis was in this century, because he certainly would have been burned at the stake if he'd lived earlier. In any case, let's go back to the first leveraged buyout, the ESOP. Lewis invented the LBO, the ESOP, to make the poor richer. The results of his studies, Lewis didn't ask, why are the poor poor? He asked, why are the rich rich? And the answer was, because they own capital. And the way finance was structured, they who owned capital now would own the capital of the future. It was a monopoly of capital credit. The first ESOP was a capital credit device. And it's still a capital credit device if it's a classic Kelso ESOP. Now, we call many things ESOPs that are actually not. They're good things, they broaden capital ownership, but they don't use future earnings of the corporation. Lewis was very against redistribution. And of course, when a few people own the things that produce wealth, and they produce far more than they can consume, they use the excess to acquire more capital and to buy politicians, I might add. What else is there? After you have 2 or 3 mansions and a corporate jet or two, what more is there to do with your money? So the first ESOP involved a prosperous newspaper chain in the peninsula of San Francisco called Peninsula Newspapers, Inc. And this is a really interesting story. The owners were nice people, and they had promised their employees that when they retired, they would give the employees the first option to buy the business. Well, the day came when the owners wanted to retire, and they called in the actuaries, and my goodness, they added up the employees' assets, and these people were well-paid employees, but they used all their income to live and to send their kids to college and have their teeth straightened. And when the auditors added up everything, they found out that the employees, if they cut their living expenses to the bone, borrowed everything they could from banks and relatives, and mortgaged their houses, they could just barely pay the interest on the loan. The loan itself would extend indefinitely. They could pay it forever. So it wouldn't fly until suddenly it did. A lawyer they never heard of found out about this, and he had wanted to try a financial device that he had invented, and this was his opportunity. He stepped in. He was a lawyer in the firm that had told them they couldn't buy the business, and suddenly they could and did. The ESOP was born. The loan was a 15-year loan, and the employees paid it off in 8.5 years, and then they were totally owners of this flourishing newspaper business. And the first ESOP was born. Well, that was 1956, and Lewis was an American, and Americans believe, God help us, that if you invent a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. Well, Lewis knew that his mousetrap was the best financial mousetrap around, and he waited for the world to beat a path to his door, but it didn't. There was no knock on the door, and no crowds, no nothing. So he decided, being indefatigable, he wrote 2 books. And the first was The Capitalist Manifesto, and the second was The New Capitalist, in which he presented, in the first book, the reasons why the income dependence of Americans had to be shifted from labor to capital, and in the second book, he explained the financing theory that was the basis of the ESOP and other financing plans that he suggested, including the CSOP, by the way, which he innovated 2 years later, and which enabled the about 7,000 farmers, I think, maybe 700, I forget, to buy, to start up a fertilizer plant, anhydrous ammonia, in the Central Valley. And this first CSOP broke the monopoly that Big Oil had established for years in the Central Valley, where they, as Lewis said, they would have lunch, they'd drink a lot, laugh a lot, and tell jokes, and then they would set the fertilizer prices for the year. And when Valley Nitrogen went online, the monopoly was broken. Fertilizer prices dropped to half of what they were, and the farmers, through this mechanism, owned the fertilizer plant and another one that was built. It was an enormous success. Big Oil was not happy, as you can imagine, and they went to Congress, and their friends there passed a bill that made sure, a tax bill, that made sure that the first CSOP would be the last CSOP. And it's never been duplicated, though in Europe there's considerable interest in it, but that's another story. In any case, when I joined Lewis in 1963, there were only 3 ESOPs, and 56 to 63 is what, 7 or 8 years. And one of those ESOPs was a quasi-ESOP. It wasn't something Lewis was proud of. There were only 2 ESOPs and a CSOP in all those years, despite the 2 books that he'd written. Well, in politics, they always ask, who's for it? And Lewis and I got asked that question a lot. Well, if this is such a hot idea, who's for it? And the who was for it was Leonard Spacek, who was the managing partner of Arthur Andersen back when Arthur Andersen was the absolute conscience of the accounting industry. When you had Arthur Andersen as your accountant, you had the best and the most ethical. Well, Leonard Spacek ordered 5,000 copies of The New Capitalist and gave one to each of his accountants. He was a fan from the beginning, but even he could not change the mindset. There were no new ESOPs because of these books. They were discussed, and everybody said, yeah, that would be nice, but nobody did anything. And Lewis got more and more frustrated. He gave from 3 to 5 lectures a week to business groups. He went to Washington and met with politicians. I did the same. I presented these ideas to Barry Goldwater when he was running for president. And he thought they were great. Lewis and I ran into Barry Goldwater once in the halls of Congress when he was senator, and he asked how things were going, and I asked him how we could get them to move faster. He said, I'll never forget this. He said, well, get Lewis to be shot. I wasn't very amused by that idea. But it gives you an idea of how very difficult it is to introduce a really radical new idea. Now, have I talked very long?
You're fine. 10 minutes?
Okay. Now, why was this so difficult? Why did it take so long? And why is it taking so long? I mean, it's wonderful that you're all here. It's exciting. You're all so bright, and you're all going to make a big difference, and you have the means in this theory to make a big difference. But why I am 90, for God's sake. I've spent 50 years at this, and Louis and I together probably spent 100 years, if you combine our careers together. What is the hang-up? Pardon? Why is capital the invisible factor? Why do we super-stimulate technology? Why do we, well, I hate to use the word lie, but when a paradigm gets more and more out of date and you still support it, you're forced to tell falsehoods and misrepresent reality. And we have done that ever since the Industrial Revolution. I call our President Trump the Luddites' revenge. Do any of you know the Luddites? Well, the Luddites are presented as technophobes. They hate technology. They didn't hate technology. They just hated not being able to have a livelihood and having their livelihood destroyed by the power loom. And society didn't even admit that their livelihoods were being destroyed or that they were worth anything. So they destroyed the power loom for a while, and they were hanged and deported. I found them very interesting and very pitiable. And by ignoring the Luddites and ignoring the whole issue of the substitution of machines and the forces of nature for the physical power of beasts and human beings, and by pretending that each new machine increases the productivity of labor, it's terrible, and we are reaping the consequences of our blindness to the fact that when the means of production change, when the input factors change, you have to change the income distribution system. And we haven't done it. We say, well, I have a cartoon mind, and I have many cartoons, and my a wealth management company likes my cartoons, and they've asked me to do one for their annual investors letter. And so I've got one. It's a Ingersoll Rand digging machine, and two workers with shovels are taking a look at the digging machine and saying, "Wow, our productivity is sure shot up. Too bad we're not employed. Too bad we're unemployed." I mean, that cartoon rather says a great deal. maybe more than people like. In any case, Lewis began to realize that his idea wasn't sweeping the world. There was some resistance that we couldn't identify and didn't understand. We wasted a lot of time. I hope you don't waste as much time as we did. The LBO was taken up by the rich to make themselves richer. Michael Milken read our first book, Two-Factor Theory, The Economics of Reality. He could have, when he was a student at Berkeley, he could have come over the bridge and talked to Kelso, but he didn't. He went to Drexel Burnham. He got the idea of junk bonds as utilizing Lewis's theory, and he became what he became. The same thing is true of KK and R. Lewis explained his theory to George Roberts, who was working at Bear Stearns. George Roberts explained it to his cousin, Henry Kravis, and their boss, Jerry Colbert. And after a while, they left Bear Stearns and founded KKR, leveraged buyout firms, buying up firms, stripping them of their assets, firing all the key employees. Lewis was furious. I mean, it's really sad, but it's the world. And so we gradually began to think about this, and Lewis died before he'd figured it out. I think I've figured it out in the 25 years since he's been dead. Lewis slaughtered 2 sacred cows, not just one, but 2. And boy, you would be burned at several stakes for that. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, the first sacred cow was the savings theory of finance, the idea that you have to buy capital from past savings, which only the rich have. Lewis has figured out that the security of an investment was the firm's future profitability, and that a bank loan could take care of the formation costs. You didn't have to finance it in such a way that those who owned savings would own the new capital that the savings invested. Okay, that's the first cow. And the second cow is the idea, this is an economic idea, and it is basically the idea that labor is the only, or at least the sole, factor of production. Now, where Lewis used to say that his contribution to economics could be summed up in 6 little words, and he would proceed to tell you the 6 little words. There are 2 factors of production. 2. And they both make input into the economy, and they both produce income. One is labor, the oldest factor, but the other is capital, which has been doing more and more production, more of the productive input since the Industrial Revolution. The Newcomen engine at first with the first steam engine seemed to make jobs, but as and we said it did. I mean, those who owned the machines, and also the newspapers and the radio stations, where opinions are projected, said that automation just makes more and more jobs. Well, it doesn't. And now that we're getting artificial intelligence, where is it all going? Lewis figured that it was going into the primitive past. He forecast that society, our society, Western society, industrial society, would implode like the Soviet Union did. But there's another ending, and I'm going to close with that. I haven't said nearly what I would have said. This is Russell Long. The popularity of Aesop begins with Russell Long, the senator from Louisiana, who Lewis took the dinner at the Montpelier room of the Madison Hotel, and Senator Long said, "Kelso, I like it. What can I do?" And he became the proponent of the Aesop in Congress. And the congressional initiative, he took it with Mike Gravel too, by the way, who wasn't here today. So I'm going to end with the words of Russell Long, who had a wonderful sense of humor. And he said, "Bring on those tired, labor-plagued, competition-weary companies, and Aesop will breathe new life into them. They will find Aesop better than Geritol. It will revitalize what is wrong with capitalism. It will increase productivity. It will improve labor relations. It will promote economic justice. It will save the economic system. It will make our form of government and our concept of freedom prevail over those who don't agree with us." And I can't end that better than to quote dear Russell.
So, Patricia, you mentioned Russell Long as a champion of Aesop. Were there others in the Congress that were particularly helpful or supportive?
Yes. A German colleague and I presented these ideas to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and afterwards, one of the European parliamentarians said to me, "Mrs. Kelso, which of your parties has been most active in promoting these ideas?" And I hadn't really thought terribly much about it, and I thought, and then I said, "Well, I'm afraid to say it's the Republicans." And he said, "Why am I not surprised?" The Republicans definitely have shown the most initiative. We have encouraged bipartisanship in Congress. Whenever we saw a Republican congressman, we saw a Democratic congressman, we submitted recommendations in both party platforms year after year. We have talked to Democrats, Senator Feinstein. I've been on several panels with her. Nancy Pelosi, they just don't get it. And I don't understand why, and I don't understand why they don't. And Republicans do seem to get it. They seem to have a better grasp of the importance of economic independence than Democrats. Democrats seem to think more in terms, and I'm generalizing, more in terms of welfare and philanthropy, whereas Republicans seem to think more about producing your living. And the Republicans before Senator Long were the moderate Republicans, were the carriers of the ESOP banner in Congress. Mark Hatfield of Oregon, for example, was a great proponent. What were some of the others, John?
Jay Rockefeller was a Democrat back then.
He never was active, but he voted for us.
He was a co-sponsor of a couple of ESOP bills.
But he was a Republican?
He was a Democrat.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about Republicans.
Oh,
I'd love to hear about the Democrats.
Well, but
yeah,
well, that would be nice, but I'm talking about who was for it and who still takes the initiative. And there is an occasional Democrat. Mike Gravel was a Democrat. Senator Long was formally a Democrat, but he would have been a Republican if he hadn't been in the South.
Well, you could mention Max Baucus was the former head of the Senate Finance Committee. He was a champion for us in a number of ESOP bills. Democrat.
Yes.
There's been
I wouldn't
more
say
Democrats than
I wouldn't
think.
But before Senator Long, you're smiling as if this is ridiculous.
No.
But I'm talking I am talking historically that the Republicans carried the banner, and the Democrats didn't vote against it, but they did not until Senator Long and Mike Gravel of Alaska became active, and they pushed the Democrats to support it. Senator Long would put his arm around you, and everybody knew when Senator Long put his arm around you, you were in deep trouble.
This is time to get in.
Just do a quick follow-up. I think that you actually mischaracterized Democrats. Well, I say this with all due respect, but I think that you mischaracterized Democrats because Democrats have been the engine behind much of the community economic development work. And although that's not the same as the ESOP, it has some of the same intent. So I'd like you to just very briefly comment on community economic development work and what you think about that.
Well, remember, Lewis identified private property as the mechanism that distributed income in the free market. Marx knew that. That's why he abolished private property in capital. In 1986, Lewis and I were in Russia, and we dropped by the USA-Canadian Institute and in Moscow, and several economists were there. They were studying the ESOP. They were terribly interested. They'd read the the Capitalist Manifesto. And I started the conversation by saying, when the communists destroyed private property, they destroyed motivation. And I thought I would get an argument and we would have a discussion. But no, they said, we know what So we have to talk about the private property implications. The, the community development and taxation and expansion of jobs through what Lewis called boondoggle is redistribution. The ESOP is a private property mechanism, and it keys people into producing income and not redistributing the income of others. And I don't think the community development does that, and incidentally, it hasn't done a lot to reduce what is called inequality. Has it?
Chris is trying to get, Chris wants to defend Democrats.
Thank you, Patricia, for that wonderful speech. I'm wondering if you've heard, there's a political science professor at Yale, Jacob Hacker, who recently has sort of taken up the concept of what he calls redistribution, which I think is really a very promising way of talking about this. Because I understand the critique of redistribution, particularly when you sort of went past it a little quickly in your talk. But it's not that you have any problem with poorer people getting money. It's just if it's going through the government, that the government is going to take its share, and you're going to have.
Lewis and I fought many years against the guaranteed annual income not because we didn't want the poor to have money, but because Lewis thought, and I think that power over your income was power over your will. And that's what our founding fathers thought. The Germans have a proverb, his bread I eat, his song I sing. Lewis thought that having political control of your income was a way for you to stay poor forever. But producing your income through your ownership of capital was a different thing.
If I could just finish the point, because I didn't make it. For the pre-distribution frame that Hacker is putting forward, because I think very compatible.
Pre-distribution. I don't know what that is.
Okay, well, let me try to explain. If the structure of ownership is set up in such a way that it is inclusive to begin with, then as wealth is being made, it is being distributed. So the pre-distribution is a sort of design architecture, which is very compatible with the ESOP idea. So before the money is being made, before the wealth is being accumulated, you're by pre-distribution design structuring your economy in the way it should be structured. As the wealth is made, it then gets shared.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. It depends on the mechanism you use, of course. And, well, the ESOP is a wonderful entry way. And Lewis regarded the ESOP as a Trojan horse that would introduce capital ownership to the economy. Yes?
But in listening to what you said, for it to really be a system that would produce this wealth for the poor, all other things would have to be equal in the system.
Pardon?
All other things would have to be equal in the system for it to theoretically allow the poor to really have that equal opportunity.
Well, as that's an interesting point, and it's one that Lewis certainly grappled with. He said that you couldn't all go through a door at the same time, and so this is why he designed plans for different constituencies. The ESOP is for workers, working people. And he also thought, and I think with him, that everybody should serve in the workforce for a while. That young people should have productive jobs. It doesn't hurt a young person to be a floor clerk floor clerk at a department store to work in a machine shop, to get an idea of what the world of production is important. But that doesn't mean you have to stay there forever. The ESOP would enable, the ESOP actively used, would do a lot. It would allow workers to retire earlier.
So I want to thank Patricia, and we have a little gift for her.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, you don't need to do that. Oh, my goodness. You're the gift.
Do you want to read it?
Yes, Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, upon recommendation of the Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations, Louis O. Kelso and Patricia H. Kelso, are presented with this visionary award in grateful appreciation of major contributions to employee ownership and for fostering research in employee ownership nationwide and worldwide. Well, thank you very much.
So again, I just want to thank Patricia for being here with us today and for your life's work.